If you're a parent, do you read books to your kids at night before bed? We're going to talk about that. Welcome to another episode of The Good, Bad, and Ugly of Business. I'm your host, Katrin Becker, and in this podcast, we talk to all sorts of different kinds of successful people because we want to learn what they have learned that has made them so successful. Because behind every successful person, there are failures, and those are usually the things we don't talk about, but there's so much more learning that we can mine out of a failure than we can from a success. So we bring these successful people together to learn what they've learned, avoid their mistakes, or fail faster through them. The guest today has a very special place in my heart. She has been someone that has been unknowingly part of our family for the last 2 years and has really made a difference in my child's life. So I'm welcoming one half of the pseudonym Maddy Mara, who is the Dragon Girls author, Hilary Rogers. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Katrin. How are you?
I am so glad to have you here. As I was sharing with you before we started recording the podcast, my daughter was in kindergarten during COVID, and it really affected her ability to read, as it did with so many other kids who were in that space and time. And your books that you and your writing partner, Meredith, have put out it was the turning point that made her interested in wanting to learn to read. So for the people who are watching the video, I can barely hold all of the books here in my hands that have been well loved, well read, gone on car trips, gone to hotel rooms, gone to all of the different places that we have gone because they have been such an impact into our lives. So firstly, and I'm just honored to have you here as a guest. You are by far the most impressive guest to my children.
I've made it with the 9-year-olds.
You have. You are like up there with Taylor Swift, I think.
It's definitely the most charming way to end up doing a podcast. I've never had a podcast organized because someone's daughter has basically encouraged them, if not told them, to meet with me.
It's one of the perks of the job, I must say, being able to be that hero in our child's lives. But Hilary, I love these books so much. And one of the things that I would love to talk about with you on here is the process that you've had, that you aren't writing this under your own name as Hilary Rogers. You have a writing partner, you go under the pen name. Talk a little bit about the thought process of not having both your and Meredith's name under the book.
Yeah, great question. I mean, the first thing is that Hilary Rogers and Meredith Badger doesn't really roll off the tongue. So there's a certain sort of practical element to it. But I also think there's a real magical alchemy when a partnership works. And I would say my partnership with Meredith works beautifully. And when we're working together, we aren't Hilary Rogers and Meredith Badger. We are a third, bigger, better thing. We are a third entity. So in some ways, choosing a pen name is a sort of symbolic version of that. You know, when we're writing together, we become something bigger and something different. And the specifics of the name Maddy Mara is really in keeping with the meeting that we're having today because it's inspired by our children. So my daughter's nickname is Mara, and Meredith's daughter's nickname is Maddy. And so we decided to pull those names together. Partly, I mean, they roll off the tongue. It's a really great name, but also they're very different types of readers, very different humans, they're different ages. And that's how we like to think about our writing, that we want to think about all of the different types of kids that are going to gravitate towards our books or who we want to gravitate towards our books. So there are so many reasons behind that, but they're both practical and metaphorical and everything in between.
Oh, and quite precious, really, to be having them part of that process. And I love the concept of this third entity, this 1 + 1 not equaling 2. You know, this 1 + 1 equaling so much more than that. But that's not always typical in partnerships.
No, it's definitely the Holy Grail. And I mean, look, writing partnerships I mean, you rightly pointed out before we started recording that everybody's working with others, whatever industry that they're in, and whether it's even just a, collaboration at home, running a household or whatever it might be. but it is particularly unusual to write with someone else. You know, usually book writing is a fairly solitary activity. And of course, you're always working with editors and publishers later on. But to be collaborating in those early creative moments is fairly unusual. And it's definitely not something that would work for everybody. And it's not something, Meredith and I have both written separately. And I've written with others. I've had another partnership before I was working with Meredith that didn't work perfectly. And so I know from experience that not all partnerships, you know, even with the best will in the world and two fabulous people who want to make it work, it doesn't always work. So I think some of the things that I've learned, there's sort of a few different schools of thought when you're thinking about partnering with someone, whatever it is that you do, whether you're writing or working, you know, in another part of business. They often say one school of thought is partner with someone who's as different to you as you can cope with, you know, that's got all of the other aspects of life, you know, different personality traits, different skills, different experiences. And there's a real logic to that. You can come to the table and click together and you can be very different. And that's what I did initially. So I worked for a long time in-house as an editor and a publisher. So my career was 15 years working in travel publishing and then children's publishing as a commissioning editor, publisher, publishing director before I started writing. And so when I first left in-house work and decided that I wanted to write, I partnered with someone who was exactly that, really confident, loads of business experience, big ideas, really comfortable with risk. And all of the things that I didn't perceive in myself. I felt that I had this very careful editorial background. I was very experienced in the publishing industry. You know, there were certain things I could do really well, but I didn't feel entrepreneurial or bold or brash or good with risk. And so I made that decision quite carefully. And we had a lot of fun working together, and he was fantastic, but it didn't work ultimately. The alchemy wasn't there. And I think in the end, our styles of communication and our work ethic are the things that probably didn't quite. He had a lot of fingers in a lot of pies, which is great. This was my pie. This was the thing I wanted to do. I wanted to write books for kids and I wanted to be able to support my family doing so. Whereas for him, there was less hunger around that because he had a lot of other jobs and a lot of other companies that he was running. So after that didn't work, I thought about what it is I really need and what it is that works well for me. And interestingly, Meredith and I had worked together for years. So we worked together for probably nearly 20 years before I left. No, probably more like 15 years before I left publishing. So she'd been a writer, she'd been a friend. She'd given me one of my first jobs. Our lives had sort of moved in and out, but so we were much more alike and much more connected, and we'd worked on books together. So in some ways, that's the opposite of that piece of advice of partner with someone who's as different as possible. In some ways, Meredith's a version of me, but of course, there are always distinctions. I had a much stronger publishing background. She had a much stronger writing background. And within that are the usual ebbs and flows of personalities. So I ended up completely turning my back on that piece of advice and partnered with someone who's much more aligned with me. And in this instance, I'm sure there's countless examples of different outcomes, but in this instance, that's been fantastic for us because we both have a huge amount invested in it. We both have extraordinary work ethics. We're very productive. We're highly communicative. So it's a very normal day that we would be communicating across email, WhatsApp, the back end of Instagram, and at some point scheduling a phone call and perhaps catching up for coffee the next day. We're just across every platform and throwing ideas around and discussing what is and isn't working. And that really works for us.
I
Very
love
long
that. No, it's perfect though, because it definitely, you know, because just like you were saying with the two schools of thought about similar or different, there's also the, like, you know, defining your lane, right? That's a school of thought as well when it comes to partnership, where it's very clearly defined, like, this is what you do and this is what I do. Whereas you guys are doing more of the similar stuff. And the only sort of example I can think of how this has been in my life has been in school writing papers, right? Whereas group work, or in the corporate world writing proposals. And when somebody would be set to write, like, okay, this is the section you're going to write, it was always very clear whose voice and tone it was. And we had to do a lot of work then to make it sound like one cohesive document.
Yes.
So I'm so just
Yeah.
curious as
Yeah.
what that process is like for you and Meredith.
Yeah, you often talk about the sort of the Frankenstein manuscript where, someone or proposal where one person's written this bit and someone else has written that. And it just, you can almost see the seams and the nuts and bolts trying to kind of hold it
Exactly.
together. So that's definitely the peril. And look, there are so many different ways that writing teams work. And for Meredith and I, it does depend on the project. So if we're writing a picture book, for example, we would often, one of us will come up with the initial idea and then maybe write a verse, and then someone else might be, oh, pattern we want to use, and then we'll think about, and then we might write different verses each, and then we pull it together and it comes back and forwards and it goes in that way. And in some series we've got short stories within one book, and so we might write a story each and then swap them. And often we find we've plagiarized each other or copied ideas, and then we'll be like, actually that beginning works better over here, so we will sort of cut and paste. But with our most successful series, which, as Willow has kindly highlighted for us, with Dragon Girls, which has been the most successful series globally, but, particularly in the US, in that instance, what we tend to do is we workshop the ideas really closely at the beginning. We decide exactly who the girl is, exactly what the adventure is going to be, what all the themes are going to be. Obviously, we do that in consultation with our publishers, Scholastic. And then Meredith writes a draft, and then I go. So we take it in turn. So she will write, and we do it actually, we don't do a full draft and then over to me. We do chapter by chapter. So Meredith usually goes first, and then I go second. And by the end of it, and so we go back and forwards as we're writing the chapters, then we have a full manuscript, and then we both do more passes each in a full manuscript. So by the time we're sending it to the publisher, we call it a first draft, but it's a third or fourth draft, really. And we have both gone over it countless times. And because of the sort of people we are, and because we're each other's biggest fans, we're both convinced that the best bits were written by the other one. And we can never quite remember, because Meredith might do something fabulous and then I'll just add a little bit, and then she'll be like, oh, that's the best bit. And I'll be like, no, you wrote the whole thing. I just did this tiny bit. Or, we've always got that sort of backwards and forwards. So there's no ego involved in, well, I did this and you did that. It really becomes very enmeshed. So that blurring of boundaries works really well for us.
And truly becoming Maddy Mara.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But I think that would be a little bit frightening for some people. I think particularly writers are often accustomed to, these are my words. This is my idea, and an editor can come in and sort of, help with that and craft that. And most people respect that process. But I think doing it pre-editorial is an interesting one that would require, really our focus is sort of like to the higher plane. It's like, if it works, who cares who added that section or had that idea? We just want the books to be enchanting. And I think we're both pretty good at stepping back and saying that might not have been my idea, but it's so much better than what mine was. Again, back to this idea of the two of you being better than the sum of your parts, that you become something bigger than each of you could be on your own.
And speaking of big, Dragon Girls is pretty freaking huge.
It's kind of a big deal now. Yeah.
I mean, how many millions of copies have sold at this point?
Quite a few millions. I think we're at about 3 last I counted, but it's a bit hard to tell because it's big in Australia. But of course, there are far fewer zeros in Australia because it's a much smaller population. And actually, that's one of the key things that we wanted to do when we were looking at how to be creative and how to do the things we love and keep bread on the table for our families. And so it's a little bit unusual the way we work to try and get these millions, is that basically we develop ideas with Scholastic in the US and also Scholastic in Australia. It's another partnership that we work on. So often we'll say, are you interested in something like this? And they'll say, actually, that's a really important gap in our market, or would you think about doing something like this? Or we're looking for whatever the next replacement for the Babysitters Club is, or, they might have an idea, we might have an idea, and we come and we sit and we talk about what does and doesn't work, and we develop ideas all together. And then when Meredith and I then go away and come up with the characters and the adventures and all the mad things that we put into our books, then it goes into the Australian market, which is how a normal Australian author would work, because they've got an Australian publisher. But normally, if the books then are Australian and they make their way to America, the Australian publisher would try and pitch them to an American publisher. They're already a done deal, and that Americans would say, I'm not sure about the cover, or yes, we love it, whatever it might be. But in this instance, we're working with two markets from the beginning. So we're saying to the Americans, because they're basically American books,
Sure.
we're saying, what illustrator would you use? And they're in charge of that, and is it elementary or junior high? We can never remember here in Australia because the school system's different. And so we're from the get-go, we've got two cultures and two markets in mind, rather than doing one and then hoping for more. And so that's what's allowed us to work in this really collaborative way with the US and not be Australians trying to make it in the US, but actually working directly with Americans. So it's an unusual process, and it means we can write full time. It's given us the freedom, because it's so successful, to do most writers can't support themselves with their writing. They either need a partner that can support themselves, they need another job, or they need to be independently wealthy. And unfortunately, none of those were options for us.
Well, and it's something that's so common that people think like, oh, you write a book and you're going to be, a billionaire, right? Like you're going to make all of this money. And that's not the reality for most writers. But something that you said is something that's really clever that I really want to pinpoint. And this is something that I think it's an error that so many of us make in all different aspects and parts of life, in that we create the thing first and then go try to find the market for it, rather than being in conjunction and working with it and saying, okay, this is what is being asked. And it's kind of a catch-22 situation, because then you look at things like, Henry Ford's quoted as saying, if I asked them what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So it's kind of a crazy balance in that creative process. How do you and Meredith balance that?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, because people do. If you ask a child, for example, what series they want more of the series they already love. So they won't necessarily envisage that. So your job as a creative is to think, well, what is so magical about Bluey or Dragon Girls or whatever it is that, the bad guys, whatever it is that's enchanting your kid, and sort of looking at those components. So you definitely have to take your readers and the adults with them, because of course the adults are the gatekeepers. The kids don't have their own money. They need, access to be able to buy the books. You have to take them on a journey, but respect what they love and where they've been. And I do agree. I think there's a wonderful notion of writers sitting in their sort of, dusty ivory towers, coming up with ideas and just writing what they love and just hoping that the readers will find them. And every now and then that works. We all know the exceptions where that's worked. But as you say, most people don't reach a big enough audience to be able to live off their writing. 95 at least % of writers would not be in a position to do that, certainly in Australia. So for us, what we love is, if we know, it sort of seems a little bit grubby to look at the market and think, what does the market need? But if you think, in my case, the market is kids. So it's not that grubby, really. And it's like, okay, so what is happening in 9-year-olds' lives? What do they love? What are they watching? What are they thinking? What are they worrying about? What are they, because you need to be relevant. You can't have this sense that just because you've written a book that you feel really great about, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for them. And you are competing with everything else. You're competing with their schoolwork, with TikTok, with YouTube, with whatever else is going on in their lives. You are competing with that. And it's better to acknowledge that and see that as a challenge rather than sort of, be all distressed about the fact that kids aren't reading as much. If kids aren't reading as much, what are we going to do about it? So, and we definitely need the gatekeepers on board, but it is, we find it quite refreshing to think, okay, that series tanked. Why did it tank? That series is going really well. Why is it going well? And we're not going to plagiarize it. We're not going to do the same thing, but what's working is that it's this great mix of illustration and action, or it's funny, but also a bit scary, or what is it that's making that work? And how can I take that into my new project? So we love knowing already what Scholastic wants, rather than writing something and then pitching it to a publisher and crossing your fingers and toes and hoping they'll love it. If they already want that idea, then it's all about the execution. And for us, that's really exciting. So, for example, our follow-up series, as we were just talking before, to Dragon Girls is our fairy series, which is just launched, Forever Fairies. And Scholastic actually said to us, we want a fairy series. And my immediate reaction to that is, we're about dragons and fierce girls, and fairies are sort of dainty and pretty, and it's not as interesting, it's not as feminist, it's not as exciting. And then we thought, well, let's do all of that. Let's make it.
Yeah, what if it was
brave and exciting, and and let's have countless ways to be a fairy. You don't have to be dainty. You don't have to love frocks. You don't have to want to do good. You can be cheeky or curious or adventurous or fast or you're sporty. You can be all those things, and you can still have that magical world. So for us, that's a different flavor of challenge. So we know what it is that our publishers want, and we want to make it interesting and make sure that if a kid loves Dragon Girls, they might love Forever Fairies, because we're thinking about those sorts of back end things.
It's still those same elements. I mean, I know for me, when Willow said she wanted Dragon Girls, the title alone, I think, is genius, because everything else that was dragon oriented was all for boys. I have an older son, Willow's brother's 2 years older, and he liked How to Train Your Dragons and Wings of Fire and all of these other more masculine driven storylines. And she loved dragons, but it never felt like anything was right for her. So this story just completely resonated and sung to her heart. I mean, it was literally like you could have created it, nothing else more perfect for her. The fact at school, and during recess, she has dragon school where she has recruited other kids to learn how to become a dragon.
Oh my goodness. How much are we going to have to pay Willow to be our ambassador? Does she charge top dollar?
She would do it out of the goodness of her heart because it would make her so very happy.
See, that's so beautiful.
So I love that you're still thinking of those same elements with the fairies, and that's still that same heart of Maddy Mara is there and lives.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful because it's going to attract a different group of girls.
Yes. I mean, you're always just trying to trick kids into, to get off their screens and onto the page, because we know as adults, like, I mean, I can feel my attention span seeping out of my ears. I know what screens are doing to my brain.
Yeah.
And I know that if I spend half an hour doom scrolling versus half an hour on the couch curled up with a book, I do not feel the same after those 2 half hours. And some people that might be fine. Some people relax on screens and go for it. I mean, I love watching trashy Netflix as much as the next person,
Sure.
But in terms of the doom scrolling, and that is, increasingly what kids are doing with, multiple tabs open and all their different apps, it doesn't have the same impact on your brain.
Right.
And so I think our job as, writers and publishers and parents and teachers and whatever our role is with the kids in our lives is to help them, trick them into that. And we can't just say it's better for you. We've got to just be so clever. We've got to make it appealing. And I just think that's the job. It's not a sort of, well, books are better than screens. It's kind of, I'm gonna draw you in, and I'm gonna make sure that you're playing a game that's related to a book series at lunchtime as much as you are something that you've watched on Netflix. So
And I love how you use the word
it's such a-
enchanting. I love that word. I don't think it's used enough. And that's exactly what it is. It's about bringing them into that imaginary world and having that enchantment
Yeah.
for it. It's,
We try and do two things. We want kids to lose themselves in the books that we write, but we also want them to find themselves in those books. So you need to come up with a world that feels safe and fully formed and magical enough to be a reprieve from the pandemic or whatever isn't happening at home or at school. You want an escape room, but you also want kids to be like that. I worry about that too, or I'm quite good at that, or that's something I see in myself, whether it's a way of thinking, a way of feeling, a way of looking, whatever it is, you need kids to sort of feel, it needs to feel relevant in that way. So the enchantment of the world and the enchantment of seeing yourself in that world, they're the things, that's when writing works.
So kind of to bring together the two different pieces that we've talked about, we talked about the creative piece, the imagination, building these worlds and these characters and bringing in these themes. But then there's also the business side. And, you've been so fortunate to make it to be your full-time profession. Those are very different skill sets.
They are.
How do you balance them? And do you feel that you are learning or growing in one area more than the other?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the balance is a fallacy. There is no balance. There's
true.
moments of balance, but I think on the whole, you might find balance across a week, but you won't necessarily find balance in a day. A little bit
100%.
like all aspects. But I sort of think of it. I mean, I'm very lucky that I had a publishing background, because when I worked as a publisher, so I was running I was a children's publisher in an Australian publishing house. So you have lots of authors, lots of books, you have series, you have picture books, young adult, and you've got to juggle that. So you've got to draw back and think of what's selling, what's costing you, you've got the cash flow, you've got all of those aspects, as well as the creativity of making those books work and managing the talent and your team and all the rest of it. So in some ways, that was a great grounding for the mix of business and creativity that we now bring to Maddy Mara. But I also see it as you can only wear one hat at a time, otherwise you look like a madwoman. So you need to be able to draw right back and say, okay, this is going really well, but what's in 2025, 2026? I possibly need a new series to launch then, which means if it's 12 to 18 months to get a series, then, so you have to be able to have this ability to sort of think about cash flow and publishing schedules, really drawing back, which is not what most authors do. Most authors are thinking about their word count and their characters and that sort of stuff. So the ability to draw back, which is much more my wheelhouse than Meredith's, just because of my experience. But then you need to be able to fling that hat off and really drill down and sort of figure out why that chapter isn't working and what kind of a decision that character would make, and is that in keeping with what's happened and in the previous books and all the rest of it. So it is that zooming out and zooming in, which I think many authors don't do. And I think a lot of publishers do, and perhaps it's not really recognized, because publishers, most people sort of focus on the authors as the heroes, but actually I just think publishers are so clever, and none of the business success that Meredith and I have had as Maddy Mara would be possible without the publishers being open to the idea of working with these mad Australians who have far too many ideas. I mean, they must think we're bonkers, because we're always like, I know we've got 4 series, but here's another 2 pictures that we're going to send. Okay, we've just got this crazy sort of work ethic. And because we've removed, when you work in a business, in the traditional sense, you've got meetings about meetings, you're managing people, you've got templates, you've got new software, you've got all of those components, you've got presentations, blah, blah, blah. Whereas for Meredith and I, it's let's write that chapter. There's a cleanliness to it. We've got rid of a lot of that admin, still a lot of admin, of course, contracts, and, we've both
can't avoid all of it.
there's always that, but there's a lot less gumph than there is when you're working in-house or in a big team. We've sort of pared it right back. So I can't remember. Where did we start, Katrin?
I
Where am I?
mean, it's all about, we were talking about balance and business and the
Balance.
creative and
There's a lack of balance there when I can't remember where we started.
but it is nice to be able to lean on the publishers. In today's world of Amazon, there's a lot of self-publishing going on. There's a lot of independent publishers, and it's just a very different world and scale within this very specific thing.
That's true. And I think in the US in particular, self-publishing is more of a prospect. In Australia, it happens a bit, and there are always exceptions of these breakout successes. But invariably, I think in both territories, when a self-publishing enterprise is very successful, it's usually then picked up by a publisher. So there is still an extraordinary reach that a publisher can bring. And I think one of the things that I'm really grateful for my background in publishing for is that often for authors, there's this sense that publishers are not bringing very much to the table and probably making loads and loads of money while authors are sort of sweating and, struggling, and, that their creativity is being capitalized on by publishers. And having worked as a publisher and really closely with publishers, it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, you would not go into publishing to try and make money. It's very much a labor of love, and it can be very successful, but it is incredibly difficult. And the cash flow process of, if you think from a publisher's perspective, they put all of the money and risk into the cycle in terms of their staff. They pay the authors in advance. They pay for the illustrations. They print the books, they warehouse the books, they distribute the books. All of that is costing a publisher money. And then if it happens to sell at the end, they'll get some money. Whereas the author is putting in their sweat and their labor and their creativity, which is, of course, worth more than our society perhaps suggests. But so for me, I've always seen it as a much more of a joint venture. And I don't see it as, it's something, there is no way Willow would have found our books and fallen for them in the way that she has if Scholastic wasn't in schools all around the US. It just wouldn't have happened. I'm an Australian. Yeah. I mean, maybe if we'd published here and then Scholastic decided to pick it up and but it's virtue of their reach that, we can do what we do. So it's definitely not for everybody. I totally understand. There's a lot of people who can't get to a traditional publisher, or who love the idea of self-publishing, or want to work with a smaller publisher. There's so many different ways in, but I have so much respect for the work that publishers do, and the fact that, I mean, they need us as much as we need them. There's this sense that they're going to say no to everything. And, publishers are they want great books to sell. So they're looking for us as much as we're looking for them as writers.
Yeah, it's an interesting human experience on how the I don't know if fear is the quite the right word, but maybe like the hesitation to put ourselves out there for the possibility of rejection. And it happens in so many cases. You think about different magazines and anything that's putting out content, that they're always looking for more ideas and more things to put out there. But we think, oh gosh, I'm going to hold it close. What if they say no? What if they don't like it? What is that going to mean about me? And it doesn't necessarily mean that in the slightest at all. So it's quite an interesting balance, the two of them. So the last question I have for you before we wrap up is, and if you don't want to answer it, I understand, but it's around, Willow's getting older. Her interests are going to shift. Do you ever see Maddy Mara, or maybe as Hilary Rogers, writing more young adult type books?
It's funny you say that, because we are actually working on a young adult pitch at the moment. So, I mean, look, it hasn't happened, and we're just doing a crazy deep dive, but we have both written for older kids in the past. We do find the early chapter book junior fiction time particularly magical. And as you were saying, this is, with Dragon Girls, it was the series that, when that switch is flicked, you have a reader on your hands. And there is something so special about being a part of that process, creating readers. And there are so many other people doing other wonderful things. It's like, we've created a reader and off you go, and you can read other people as well. So I definitely do see that. But there is something also very exciting about being able to do a deeper dive, to go further and, perhaps a little darker into characters' worlds in a way that you can when you've got a slightly older readership. We're very aware of the boundaries of who we're writing for and what is and isn't appropriate, just in terms of, obviously, general content, but even just in terms of scariness and those sorts of things. I mean, I was such a scaredy cat as a kid. I hated being scared. And my daughter's the same. She'll skip the bad bits when people are being mean to each other so she can get to the happy ending. And, so we're very aware of not making things feel unsafe in that younger age range, but being able to just kind of stretch out a little bit in the older age ranges is really appealing. So yes, we would never say never. And there are a few little ideas there that are.
Ooh, I love those. If I can water those ideas, have a little sunshine on them, help those seeds grow.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll do some photosynthesis.
Hilary, thank you so much. This has been so much fun for me personally, professionally. You are such a delight, and I'm so glad to know you as a human.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
To the listeners, thank you so much for being here. If you have a child that's in this age range, please make sure that you check out some of the amazing books that they have put out. It's incredible. If you've liked this episode, which I'm sure you have, please make sure to share it, subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.